From about September 1942 to December 1943, experiments were conducted at the Ravensbrück concentration camp for the benefit of the German armed forces. One such experiment involved the construction of a chamber. The chamber was a highly sophisticated anechoic space filled with a very light breathable gas mixture and padded with sound-absorbing rivets, creating an atmosphere of -9 decibels. Absolute silence. It was fairly well known that prolonged exposure to such a soundless environment would result in both auditory and eventual visual hallucinations in subjects. The longest record time of a subject willingly staying in such conditions was 45 minutes. For the 10 participants studied, however, they were required to stay in the chamber for 10 days, no matter the circumstances. Prisoners of the camp were coerced into participating. They did not willingly volunteer, and there was never informed consent. There was certainly no mention of participants having their vocal cords severed. The experiment called for the participants to simply not talk during the 10 days, but whether the scientists just didn't trust them or believed that following through with the order would be impossible. Before admission to the chamber, all subjects underwent forced surgery to have their vocal cords removed. On a Tuesday, March 17, 1943, the participants were sealed in the chamber and the test began. The participants were all seated in padded chairs around a foam table, facing one another. They were all secured in straitjackets. The test subjects had no means of creating any sound. They weren't tethered to their chairs, however, and were free to move around in the space if they so pleased. The test was meant to give insight into the development of social structures without auditory or visual cues, the necessities for communication. The air was sucked from the room, being replaced by a less dense alternative, and the volume level in the chamber cut to nothing. Beyond nothing. An absolute quiet that surely no one had ever experienced. The scientists looked in on the test subjects through 4 archaic security cameras, one in each corner of the small square room. The silence was so absolute that even the minute whirring of the cameras created no sound in the chamber, as there was virtually no medium to carry the sound waves. For food, the subjects each had their own cups all around the perimeter of the room, labeled 1 to 10, 1 cup for each day. The cups were soft, bendable styrofoam, incapable of shattering or making any noise, yet easily grasped and drank with the participants' heads alone. The 10 participants sat in their seats, making no movements for almost 5 hours, although signs of acute paranoia began to exhibit themselves in almost all test subjects by just the 1-hour mark. By 2 hours, participants were clearly experiencing auditory hallucinations as they would look off into strange places or snap their necks around as if being startled by something. Somewhere between 3 and 4 hours into the experiment, symptoms consistent with acute to severe schizophrenia were presenting themselves in almost all participants. Yet, it wasn't until the 5-hour mark when something finally happened. One of the test subjects slowly stood, not fighting his restraints or trying to scream, but merely calmly getting up from his seat. The other participants watched him, without moving a muscle. The man walked over to the walls of the room calmly and confidently. He then proceeded to bite down on the foam rivets meant to cushion sound. The researchers panicked. He was trying to ruin the test. This wasn't actually the case, however, because after several large bites, tearing chunks of foam off, the man began to swallow them, unable to get them down his throat. Seconds later, the man choked to death and fell to the cushioned ground soundlessly. Suicide. The researchers cursed, hoping that the other participants wouldn't try to do the same. But for the moment, none of them moved. They just looked at the man's corpse and then up at the security cameras in a strangely synchronized rhythm. Another several hours passed with no changes, and at 8 o'clock p.m., to simulate day and night within the chamber, most of the lights were turned off, and the cameras stopped rolling for a brief period in order to adjust to the dim hue of the artificial moonlight. The switch only took approximately 1 minute, but when the monitors booted back up and revealed the interior again, the room had been entirely reordered. The table was flipped on its side in a corner of the room, and the chairs were all stacked neatly beside it. All but the dead participants stood, huddled together in the center, facing inwards towards each other, absolutely still. So much so that if it weren't for the timestamp on the screens, it would have seemed as if the cameras had frozen. This eerily strange behavior lasted all through the night, not a movement made by any of the subjects. At 7 o'clock a.m., when the lights were to be turned back on, the cameras had to once again switch recording settings and were offline for a minute. Once booted up again, the researchers were shocked at what they saw. All of the test subjects were sunburned. It was impossible to see in the previous darkness, but it was now all too clear. Their foreheads and faces were by far the worst, with charred, red skin beginning to peel, but many of the participants had splotches of sunburn on much of their exposed skin, some marks even looking as though they extended under their clothing. They still stood in the same huddle as before, although the dead participant's body now lay in the center of them. This stance remained solid for several hours, no movement made, and yet the sunburns on the victims' faces grew more and more intense, especially on the forehead area where skin began to blister and flake away. It could have been assumed that the lights used were having an adverse effect, but the first sunburns must have appeared during the time when many of the lights had been turned off, meaning that the cause was something else entirely. Suddenly, 34 hours into the experiment, the cameras began to lose focus, sometimes cutting out entirely for brief intervals. Then, 10 minutes after this began to occur, all 9 participants rotated outwards from their stance and faced the cameras. All 4 cut to static as if heavy interference had disrupted the video feed. Despite wild attempts to fix the signal, the cameras remained offline for a whole 30 minutes. After that time, the interference slowly seemed to fade, and all cameras eventually came back to focus, to reveal a horrific scene. All of the liquid in the food cups had apparently been drank, most of the cups discarded on the floor, but 9 were placed on the table, which had been set upright again in the center of the room. The participants all had resumed sitting in their chairs around the table, each grasping their own cup, which was filled with some strange material. And in the corner of the room, the deceased participant's body lay, skinned, flesh torn from bone, leaving only a husk discarded in the corner. The researchers quickly pieced together that the subjects had cleaved off the dead participants' flesh with their teeth and proceeded to place most of the chunks inside of their cups. The subjects' intestines lay stretched out on the table like a horrific centerpiece, and blood soaked every participant and tarnished the foam surroundings. As the scientists watched, horrified, the participants slowly consumed the heaps of flesh around them. Crudely written with blood on the walls was a statement reading, "More food." This request was denied, despite how the participants looked into the cameras, their gazes fixed on the researchers for hours on end. Their faces had begun to mutate horribly. The sunburns had become more grotesque, forming boils and what looked like cancerous tumors all across their faces. It wasn't impossible to give them more food in actuality. There was a fairly large transition canister attached to the silent chamber that would allow for objects to be loaded inside, the air to be sucked out, and then opened from the inside. This meant that new objects could be introduced without introducing any sound into the chamber. Despite this, however, no more food was given to the participants. 48 hours into the experiment, panic erupted as the symptoms began to spread beyond the soundless chamber. Or, that is what was assumed by the researchers. This conjecture was made as the 3 scientists tasked with monitoring the chamber's continued functionality and stationed mere feet from its walls in the lab room began to complain of hearing things. Sounds that rang out in their heads with nothing to produce them. These auditory hallucinations were largely written off by the upper staff, until the 3 scientists began to develop sunburns. Most of the staff was located in a control room, 1 floor above the lab room with the soundless chamber, not physically close to the experiment taking place. Fearing that these newly spreading symptoms could possibly indicate an infectious microorganism, scientists in the control room immediately sealed the lab room door, trapping the infected 3 inside with the soundless chamber. An improvised quarantine. All other staff was checked for possible symptoms. None but the 3 closest to the chamber seemed to have been affected yet. The 3 infected individuals pounded at the lab room door for hours, glancing at the chamber nervously, becoming more and more delirious and starting to yell about nonsensical things. They assured the other researchers in the control room that the participants in the chamber were communicating with them, although this was clearly impossible as there was no way for sound to enter or leave the chamber, and the participants were all mute to begin with. These are the notes hurriedly scrawled by one of the 3 infected researchers.
I can hear them. All of them. All at once. And they're yelling so loud that I can't even close my eyes. It started as whispers. Faint voices I assumed were my own thoughts, but now they're horrible. Shrieking voices. And they know things about me. Things I've never told anyone. The voices assure me that they are trapped inside the chamber. Except not trapped. They say they don't want to leave. If they wanted to, they could, they say. My head is splitting in 2 from all the noises, and I seem to be developing a rash on my forehead. With the test subjects, we had assumed it was a form of sunburn, but experiencing it myself and examining it on my colleagues up close, the marks bear a much closer resemblance to radiation burns. The voices, those in the chamber, need food. They say that communicating to me and to each other uses up a lot of energy. They want me to kill one of the researchers in here with me. They say they'll take care of the other. Then they want me to stuff the bodies into the chamber. If I don't, they say they'll kill me too.
The notes end there. There were security cameras monitoring the outside of the chamber as well, showing the lab room, and 2 scientists were reassigned to now observe the infected individuals, as both a separate, yet linked, side experiment. These are the notes taken by one of the 2 researchers tasked with this new experiment.
Infected number 3 is writing in his journal, glancing around more and more at the other 2. He seems incredibly nervous and appears to be staring at a large metal pipe for minutes at a time, gripping his head and shaking no over and over. Infected number 2 seems to be arguing with himself, but... New advancement. The time is 57 hours, 21 minutes into experiment. Infected number 1 has just collapsed and is currently seizing on the ground. He's clutching his head in agony, and it appears as though the blood vessels in his eyes have ruptured. The sunburn on his face is growing alarmingly fast. It's almost as if he's being physically branded. Infected number 3 has now set down his notebook and stood up. He is walking over to the lead pipe on the ground, unaware or uncaring towards infected number 1. He has now picked up the pipe, and the time is 57 hours, 23 minutes into experiment. Both infected number 1 and number 2 are dead. Infected number 1's spasms finally ceased as he drowned in a pool of his own blood, skin all but burned away, eyes nearly liquefied. As this happened, infected number 3 walked up behind infected number 2 and forcefully brought the pipe down on his head. Infected number 2 crumpled to the ground, and infected number 3 continued to mash his face in again and again until the skull was visible through the flesh. Infected number 3 now appears to be loading the corpses into the transition canister. His insanity has clearly reached dangerous levels. It is recommended that he is removed before he disrupts the main experiment. Update. It has been deemed too risky to enter the lab room with a possible infectious pathogen existing within. As a result of this, the bodies of the 2 formerly deceased researchers have been successfully introduced into the chamber where the test subjects proceeded to consume them. After doing so, infected number 3 slipped even deeper into a state of psychosis and began arguing with unseen opponents. He consistently refused something, until suddenly his eyes ruptured and he fell to the floor. No breathing is present, and infected number 3 is now considered dead. The time is 58 hours, 45 minutes into experiment. This side experiment has now concluded, with all 3 infected deceased. Results inconclusive.
The notes end here. As the main experiment horrifically carried on, the participants in the chamber continued to scrawl messages on the walls with their tongues dipped in blood. Again and again they demanded more food. In fact, the only reason the security cameras ever seemed to function was to convey this message. It appeared as though any time the participants wished to perform a task such as rearrange the room or eat the corpses, the cameras would cut to static, only ever coming back to reveal the demanding messages. On the 4th night of the experiment, the professor, head of the entire operation, began to fall mentally ill. He became increasingly paranoid and began to stare directly at the monitors for hours at a time, not bothering to blink. At one point he shouted, "What are you?" yelling at the screen, but then he quickly silenced as if slipping into deep thought. The other scientists didn't notice until it was too late that for the past several hours, the professor had been hiding his forehead from view. Suddenly, though, the professor stood. His hands dropped to his side to reveal the charred red mess that was his forehead. Before anyone could say a word or try to hold him down, the man confidently strolled across the room and out into the hall. He then turned around and closed the door behind him, and everyone was so stunned and quiet that they could hear the faint click of the deadbolt locking. It was then that everyone panicked, checking themselves for burns, and yet no one else seemed affected or showed any of the symptoms. But then one scientist saw the notebook, the one the professor had used. He opened it up and flipped to the last page and grew deathly pale at what he saw written. "It's staring at me on the security camera. One of the subjects no longer appearing human. Its mouth doesn't move, but I can hear its voice. It hisses slowly.
Why do you look on with such horror, masked with stale indifference? Why do you shout and demand to know what you already recognize? You know what it is. We are the future. The advancement you have hypothesized. Communication without gestures or sounds. A notion deemed impossible. And yet we speak to you now. Our thoughts are not rejecting the energy. It burns, it mutates, and disrupts. Our own faces are proof of that, and surely you conjectured this fact. Passing through your forehead, radiation perceived as sound. Our communication is real, but if we concentrated, we'd kill you. We could overtake your thoughts, make you eat the walls till you choked and died. But we have no need to do that now. As you've seen, we've grown quite strong. But we won't kill you. No. For you see, we cannot leave. Sound, it will distract, disrupt, and fog our minds. We need you to be our provider, to do what we cannot. Leave the room in which you presently stand, and quietly lock the door. Your researchers will fall. They'll drop like flies. Their brains are weak and defenseless. And when we've killed, you'll enter again and drag them to our home. We'll eat like kings and you'll be spared, Professor. You have a choice. Stand up, get out, and let the deadbolt slide. Or writhe in agony. Don't be afraid, and listen close, for only you will be able to hear their scream.